אני פותח את הישיבה השמינית
bמשפט.
session of the trial. The Attorney General will carry on with his opening speech. I shall now turn to Western Europe, and I shall concentrate on one chapter in this doing, on the Holocaust which came upon the Jews in Holland.
When the German army turned westward in May 1940, it laid low the Netherlands among other countries. A Reichskommissar was appointed with full legislative and executive authority. In the office of the Security Police Commissioner we shall find the Special Department for Jewish Affairs, which was later known by the same name as Adolf Eichmann's Department 4B4. Heading this department in Holland were Eichmann's representatives, Serpf, Rajakovic and others. In Amsterdam, an emigration center was set up, the true purpose of which was to discover the names and addresses of the Jews and to mark them down for the final solution. The anti-Jewish campaign began immediately after the occupation, following the pattern already familiar to us from the decisions of September the 21st, 1939, which constituted the master plan for the extermination program everywhere. Anti-Jewish legislation depriving the Jews of human and civil rights, identification of Jews by compelling them to wear the badge of shame, theft of Jewish property, and finally, deportation of the Jews for extermination. Legislation to deprive Jews of their civil and human rights was initiated in 1940 through a series of laws parallel to those in occupied France, and which were implemented there in cooperation with Eichmann and his department. We shall present to you an official report by the Dutch government on this series of decrees, which began by ousting Jews from economic life, went on to dismiss Jewish officials, and branched out to copying the Nuremberg laws, forbidding movement and transfer, forbidding attendance at theaters and places of entertainment, limiting the practice of free professions, issuing of special identity cards, expulsion of Jewish children from the schools, and the order requiring every Jew to wear a badge of shame. Afterwards, Jews were forbidden to use telephones and public means of transportation, or to enter non-Jewish stores. An evening curfew was imposed, and visits to non-Jewish homes were banned. The use of bicycles, so popular in Holland, was also forbidden to Jews, and they were ordered to give up all bicycles in their possession. Here too the problem of children of mixed marriages troubled the occupation authorities. In Germany proper the issue had been raised by the military authorities, tens of thousands of whose soldiers were 1/8 or 1/4 Jews, and had to fight for the Führer and the fatherland under the shadow of their unclean origins. These would go home on leave to a partially Jewish father or mother, after witnessing with their own eyes, or carrying out with their own hands, the slaughter by the Einsatzgruppen of the Jews in the East. That is to say, of those people who were being killed for no other crime than that of belonging to the very same group as the father or mother of the German soldier. That was why Hitler himself insisted that care be exercised in dealing with this situation during wartime, and we shall see the series of special instructions relating to it. One of those in charge of anti-Jewish legislation in Holland prepared a report on his discussions of the problem and noted that Eichmann, in consultations, had expressed radical opinions, more radical than Hitler even, and demanded the inclusion of all children of mixed marriages in anti-Jewish legislation. Finally, a solution was found for this too. The accused and his subordinates gave instructions that the children of mixed marriages were to be sterilized in order to prevent them from having families. Here for the first time the Nazis encountered resistance on the part of the local non-Jewish population to the abominations they committed against the Jews. After the hounding of the Jews in Amsterdam, a general strike broke out in the city in February 1941, which spread to Utrecht, Hilversum and other places. Gas and electricity undertakings were brought to a standstill and passengers were taken off the trains. Revolt broke out. The Nazis quickly alerted SS and Death's Head units from Germany. The forced and orders were given to shoot to kill at crowds. The leaders of the Dutch resistance movement were arrested, some put to death, others imprisoned, and Jewish children of mixed marriages were dispatched to concentration camps and tortured to death. The strike was smashed by Nazi might and terror, and the process of extermination continued. Sepp, Eichmann's envoy and subordinate in Holland, reported on June the 8th, 1942, that the rest of the anti-Jewish legislation too had already been planned and was soon to be published. Things did not go so easily with the introduction of the Jewish badge. As a demonstration of solidarity with the persecuted, non-Jews in their thousands also began wearing the yellow Star of David. But, reported Cerf, we have taken energetic steps to prevent this. At first the Jews, to Cerf's surprise, were proud of their badge of shame. But later, the fear of what lay ahead became stronger, he wrote. And meanwhile, as it were by the way, the burning of synagogues had been organized in a number of districts. Along with the implementation of the first stage, that is, the identification and isolation of the Jews, and their segregation from the rest of the population, came the additional steps. Their concentration in camps and special neighborhoods, and the pillage of their property. The machine worked efficiently. In January 1942, the transfer of Jews to labor camps began. First to the Ellerkom camp, which soon became notorious for the acts of terror and cruelty executed there, and later also to other camps, Vught, Westerbork, and so forth. A superficial purge of the various parts of Holland and the shipment of Jews to camps was begun. This applied to all Jews, men and women, children and infants, difficult cases from mental hospitals, those who had sought refuge in old people's homes or homes for the blind, and even sick people in hospitals awaiting medical treatment. German thoroughness was in full evidence. At first the Germans did not know what to do with Jews of the Spanish and Portuguese community in Holland. Did these belong to the people doomed to destruction or not? Then Eichmann's office came and resolved their doubts by ruling to the effect that these were full Jews in all respects and subject to extermination with the rest of their brethren. Holland was the scene of frequent manhunts for Jews and forced transfers to camps. The Jews began to hide, as in the case of the well-known family of Anne Frank. In November 1943, the accused gave instructions to increase the reward promised to anyone revealing hidden Jews, and a monthly quota was fixed of Jews to be handed over for deportation and extermination. At that time, the twin phase of the final solution was also implemented, namely the theft of property. This too was the concern of Zepf and Rajakovic. In May 1941, the Jews were ordered to register all their movable property for sale and later to register all their property and deposit it with a German firm. The Dutch government report adds these facts. In September to October 1941, all the public institutions of the Jewish communities were abolished, and their property was deposited in a specified bank. In May 1942, the Jews were ordered to hand over all their money, gold, jewelry, and objets d'art. For purposes of blackmail and theft, the Germans were ready even to permit an occasional Jew to save his life. Eichmann's department issued instructions that for 100,000 Swiss francs, the emigration of old Jews would be permitted. Many such applications were made, but only a few could make all the blackmail payments. Only 28 Jews in this category were permitted to emigrate in accordance with this scheme. Sepp reported that, as in exceptional cases, he had permitted 8 Jews to emigrate in exchange for the transfer of an industrial plant to the Reich because of its great economic value. At the same time, a special branch carried out a program of collecting Jewish movable property, including furniture, household utensils, and objets d'art. We shall submit an official German report about this operation of the Rosenberg HQ, known as Operation M, with all the details of the plundered property. There are detailed lists describing the contents of hundreds of crates of kitchen utensils, articles of clothing, mirrors, curtains, lamps, pianos, libraries, beside priceless objets d'art. There is also a list of places to which the loot was sent, such as Berlin, Hamburg, Rostock, Bonn, Linz, Kiel, Hanover, Graz, Bremen, Lübeck, Düsseldorf, Stuttgart, Ludwigshafen, Königsberg, Munich, and many other places. The thieves saw to it that the entire German people in all parts of the state should profit from the plunder. Altogether, 29,436 freight cars were sent in 735 special trains, loaded with the stolen property of Western European Jews. Now already roofless, homeless and destitute, the Jews were crowded into camps to await their bitter fate. Adolf Eichmann learned from a top-secret source, as he wrote, that a number of people, a mere 20 hapless Jews, had been sent passports and emigration papers. Immediately he ordered a strict inquiry, gave notice that he alone would determine their fate, and in order to prevent the recurrence of such undesirable occurrences, quotes, gave instructions on November 5th, 1943, that henceforth contact with the outside world from the camps would be made more difficult. A Jew would be permitted to send only one postcard per month. The postcard must be written in German and its contents restricted to greetings and information about personal matters. All such mail must be sent to Eichmann's office in Berlin, whence it would be forwarded to its destination. The problem of the property of foreign nationals had to be solved. Eichmann wrote to the foreign ministry asking for a decision on the property of Jews who were not Dutch nationals and also of Jews of foreign domicile living in Germany. He suggested a consultation on the question, which was organized by the Foreign Office on his initiative and attended by representatives of all the ministries concerned. The principle was laid down, thenceforth to apply to all the satellite countries, that Germany surrendered her right to receive from foreign countries the property of the German Jews resident in those countries when they were sent to extermination camps, and on the other hand decided not to transfer to foreign countries the property of their Jewish citizens who had been resident in Germany and would be deported therefrom. This rule was established for all the occupied countries in the following terms, in quotes: in order to facilitate the operation already begun, and in order not to endanger the solution of the Jewish problem in Europe which is being implemented, it is hereby laid down that the negotiations with foreign governments relating thereto shall be conducted on the basis of the territorial principle, unquote. In other words, the property of Jews sent to be exterminated would remain in the country from which they had been dispatched without regard to their citizenship.
This is another example, Your Honours, of the fact that the plunder was closely linked with the killing as two aspects of one and the same operation. This territorial principle henceforth constituted a guiding line for the countries under German Nazi rule and an acceptable bribe for satellite countries to deport their Jews, and above all, their Jews of foreign citizenship, in order to enable them to confiscate their property. In a number of places, as we shall see, the expulsion of stateless or foreign individuals was begun, and after people there had grown accustomed to the idea of the Jews being deported and their property stolen, as a rule, the turn of the local Jewish citizens would also come. Let us return to Holland. Now that the decision about property had been reached, everything was ready for the final steps. The Jews had been isolated, labeled, assembled, robbed of their property, squeezed dry to the last drop. Now came the phase of their shipment to camps and where their bodies would be further exploited by sweat and exhausting labor. Their hair would be clipped for various uses, and finally they would be sent to the gas chambers. After death, their gold teeth would be extracted from their mouths and their wedding rings removed from their fingers. These too were valuable. And when this ghastly work was done, their corpses would be piled into furnaces, and of these human beings only a pile of ashes would remain. Order was maintained and efficiency prevailed. The transport arrangements to the east were made by Eichmann and his department. We shall submit the documents calling meetings in Eichmann's office, the minutes of the meetings he conducted and the instructions he issued. Officially, in correspondence with the German Foreign Ministry, these were still couched in terms of deportation for labor and assignment for work in Auschwitz of 40,000 Jews from occupied France, 40,000 Jews from Holland, and 10,000 from Belgium. In this correspondence, Eichmann repeatedly emphasized that only people capable of work were involved. At a later stage, I shall discuss the meaning of deportation to Auschwitz. But let me say immediately that Herr Eichmann was deceiving his Ministry for Foreign Affairs. In his operation orders to his units, he laid down that each transport from France, Belgium and Holland was to include 10% of Jews unfit for work. It is clear that those those capable of work were to give of their strength and energy as slave laborers, while the rest would be passed on for immediate extermination. The deportations from Holland began in the middle of July 1942. After a month and a half of gathered experience, Eichmann convened his envoys for consultations in Berlin, and each presented a report on his operations. Eichmann demanded that the deportations be completed by the end of the year, fixing July 1943 as the final date. He demanded special efforts during the ensuing months and stated that the railway management would be unable to provide transport during November to January, but undertook to arrange for at least one train a day. The deportations proceeded apace. At the end of April 1943, Zepp reported to Eichmann that he had not succeeded in completing his work, and that only 68,300 Jews had been deported so far, leaving about 71,700. A more vigorous operation was immediately decided upon, and Eichmann named the end of 1943 as the ultimate date for its conclusion. He demanded 8,000 deportees during May and 15,000 in June. Detailed instructions were issued on the compulsory sterilization of children of mixed marriages. Eichmann decided on further encouragement for Dutch informers against Jews in hiding, who in return for information on large number of Jews would be relieved of the obligation to report back to prisoner of war camps, which had then been imposed on part of the Dutch population in reprisal for intensified underground activities. In order to avoid possible difficulties on the part of Sweden, the protecting power for Holland, it was decided to enact a special law whereby Dutch Jews, like those of the Reich, would lose their nationality the moment they crossed the state frontier on their journey eastwards. Zepp was enjoined to carry out the orders to the letter, and indeed the second half of 1943 was a period of increased activity. The trains rolled eastwards, loaded with their human cargo. Finally, only scattered groups of Jews were left in Holland. These included such people as skilled diamond craftsmen whose services were required by Germany. Their future was left to be decided by Himmler himself. There were also a few Jews employed in collecting metals for the German war industry, and some who had fought in the ranks of the German army during the First World War. Altogether, these totaled 870 persons who were deported to Theresienstadt. Over 1,000 Jews were still employed in German armament plants at the Wucht camp. These too were eventually deported, and the street searches after those in hiding continued. About 120,000 Jews were deported and removed to extermination camps in Poland. A few were deported to other places, and of these, about 5,000 survived. This, in brief, is the tale of extermination in one country where Adolf Eichmann operated. The same story will be repeated in all the other countries, with some slightly different nuances in style, with minor adaptations to local conditions, variations on a single theme of atrocity, murder and extermination. Let us begin with the north. In Norway, there were a handful of Jews, some 1,750 in all. About half fled to Sweden. The remainder were deported to the extermination camps in Poland. The Norwegian underground did what it could to smuggle out Jews. The people resisted the extermination campaign and accordingly brought upon themselves a campaign of blood-stained terror. Here also human rights were abolished. Property was looted, identification cards were stamped with the Jewish mark, searches and arrests were instituted, and finally, towards the end of 1942, came the deportations. The treatment of the Jews was in the hands of the commander of the security police, the BDS, about whom the accused said, "This was my office." The accused did all he could to frustrate the Swedish government's efforts to rescue the Jews of Norway. His office wrote to the German Foreign Ministry, I quote, "The Swedish government in relation to these Jews is conducting a transparent naturalization stratagem which should not be agreed to," unquote. In another document, Eichmann complained that the Swedish government is attempting to frustrate the efforts adopted against the Jews. Of the 800 Norwegian Jews deported, 21 survived. At the time of Denmark's capitulation, about 6,500 Jews were living there. Because of special circumstances, the Germans at first permitted the local authorities to continue to operate. They hoped to establish Denmark as a Musterprotektorat, a model protectorate. King Christian remained the formal ruler of the state, and the Danish government continued to function. This explains why the anti-Jewish laws were not enacted, nor was the Jewish badge introduced. The king intervened personally on behalf of the Jews of his country. The Germans themselves were hesitant, and the foreign ministry doubted the advisability of imposing the extermination campaign on Denmark. But when it came to the Jews, a man like Eichmann would never retreat. As early as April 1943, he told von Taden of the foreign ministry, and I quote, "They will shortly persuade you to change your attitude." And indeed, Eichmann won through. An outbreak of strikes and the intensification of the anti-German underground operations provided a convenient opportunity. A state of war was declared by the occupation authorities. In September 1943, the SS, the Angel of Death, the senior commander of the security police, the BDS appeared in Copenhagen, and immediate plans were laid for hunting down the Jews. We shall submit to you the Danish government's official report, which describes the activities of the commander of the security police, Dr. Mildner. As a safety measure, Eichmann sent his second-in-command, Rolf Ginter, to Denmark, together with a number of other people from his department. For reasons of its own, the army of occupation was doubtful whether to cooperate in the hunt. The foreign minister then approached Eichmann as one having unlimited authority on Jewish questions and requested him to persuade the army to recant. The roundup finally took place during the first 2 days of October 1943. The barbarians broke into Jewish homes, seized Jews in the streets and brought them in. But then something occurred that stunned the murderers. Most of the Jewish homes turned out to be empty. The Danish people, having prior knowledge of the murderous plot, had organized courageously and at great risk, under the very noses of the occupation authorities, an underground rescue operation which became known as the Miniature Dunkirk. Fishing and excursion boats and any other vessel able to float were mastered at the ports. The Jews were escorted to the coast by scouts, students and other volunteers, put on board
and their imprisonment in the Braindonk camp. It was in this camp that whenever one of them was executed, the Jews were ordered to march before the corpse, singing the camp anthem. Wir werden nie Braindonk vergessen, das Paradies der Juden. Never shall we forget Braindonk, the Jewish paradise. In the Belgian government's official report on the extermination, this phase was called la phase préparatoire, the preparatory phase. This was followed by what the report called la phase d'extermination, the extermination phase. Here again we witnessed the looting of property and the deportations, first to collection and concentration camps and then eastwards. The following is an extract from this official Belgian report on the deportations to the collection camps at Malines. Quotes. When they arrived at Malines and the doors were opened, a terrible sight was revealed. When they opened the doors of each tragic truck, thick fumes and a disgusting odor escaped. And out of the doors, forced open by the pressure from within, there poured out like fish spilling out of a fishing boat, one of whose sides had been removed, a horrible conglomeration of bloated, reddened and bluish bodies, their eyes protruding from their sockets and clothes soaked in sweat and excrement. 9 corpses were removed from the trucks. 80 unconscious people were transferred to the infirmary. Unquote. The mass arrests began in July 1942. In August, the deportations to Auschwitz commenced. Through the various documents we shall submit to you, we shall prove Eichmann's direct responsibility for the extermination of tens of thousands of Belgian Jews. Only a part of the Jewish community of this country survived, thanks to the assistance of the underground, which on one occasion attacked a deportation train and enabled some of the condemned to escape, and to the fact that the Christian population hid a number of Jews. Some of the Jews were saved by fleeing to other countries. Eichmann sent his assistant Burger to Belgium, and in accordance with his directives, the first step was the deportation of stateless Jews. At a later stage, the scope of the operation was extended to Belgian nationals. Here again we see Eichmann planning, initiating and pushing aside every obstacle in the path of the extermination. In France too we shall find Department 4B4 operating in accordance with the familiar formula. Here Eichmann operated personally, together with his lieutenants who headed the Jewish section of the security police headquarters. First came Dannecker, followed by Röttger, and finally Alice Brunner, the Frenchmen Pierre Laval and Darnon, who collaborated in their work. In France, too, we shall see the same path of suffering, the negation of human rights in the series of laws of September the 27th, 1940, compulsory registration, the marking of business establishments, night curfews, and the Jewish badge. Concurrently, the plunder of property took place, and the Jews were hunted down and assembled. Many of the hunts took place in Paris itself. The captured Jews were taken to collection camps, Drancy, Compiègne, Pithiviers, Bonne-la-le-Roland, and others. From there they were consigned eastwards to death. The Vichy authorities also abandoned the Jews to the tender mercies of the Germans. In the first instance, the stateless Jews were taken, followed by foreign nationals, and finally, despite Marshal Pétain's opposition, French citizens as well. And here again we shall see the underground, the French maquis, doing what it can to help people to hide and escape. But German efficiency was victorious. Eichmann dealt personally with the deportations from France, and his representative went to Pierre Laval to bargain over the expulsion of the Jews. His stewards forcibly separated children from parents, the mothers holding on to their offspring and begging the butchers to leave them together. You will hear a description of these dreadful scenes. At the end, no more than 4,000 children between the ages of 2 and 14 were left. On July the 21st, 1942, Dannecker recorded the substance of Eichmann's orders with respect to these children in these words. He, Eichmann, decided that once it would be possible to renew the transports through the General Gouvernement, children's transports can get underway. Unquote. And indeed, as early as August 14, 1942, Röttger reported to the accused and informed the Auschwitz camp command that the deportation of the children had been started. Listen to a description of how these children arrived at Drancy. Quotes. The children would arrive at the Drancy camp packed in buses guarded by policemen. They would be put down in a courtyard surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by a platoon of French gendarmes. The police and the gendarmes, hard people, not easily given to emotion, could not hide their feelings and their abhorrence for the task they were compelled to carry out. On the arrival of the buses, they would begin to remove the children and lead them in groups to the halls, the older ones holding the hands of the small children or carrying them in their arms. They did not weep, these children. They walked terrified, disciplined, miserable, and complied with the orders like a flock of sheep, one helping the other. Unquote. Listen how they were deported from Drancy. Quote. On the day of deportation, they would be wakened at 5 o'clock in the morning. Irritable, half asleep. Most of the children would refuse to get up and go down to the courtyard. The volunteer women would have to urge them gently, patiently, and so tragically, so as to convince the older children that they must obey orders and vacate the halls. On a number of occasions, the entreaties did not help. The children cried and refused to leave their mattresses. The gendarme would then enter the halls, take up the children in their arms as they screamed with fear, struggling and grasping at each other. The halls were like a madhouse. The scene was too terrible for even the hardest of men to bear. In the courtyard, they would call out the names of the children one by one, mark them off in the register, and direct them to the buses. When a bus filled up, it would leave the camp with its cargo. Since many children remained unidentified and others would not answer to their correct or assumed names, they would include them in the convoy to make up the number. Each convoy consisted of 500 children and 500 adults chosen from the camp prisoners. Within a period of about 3 weeks, during the second half of August and the first part of September 1943, 4,000 children, thus made into orphans, were transported in this fashion, intermixed with adult strangers. Hauptsturmführer Röttger was present at these transports and would inspect personally the parading of the children, the roll call, and the loading into the buses. Unquote. Eichmann thought that France was backward in carrying out the deportations, and a ramified correspondence ensued. In April 1944, Department 4B4 issued an order to arrest all Jews irrespective of nationality. Eichmann ordered that informer money to be drawn from their property be paid for information leading to the apprehension of Jews in hiding. Southern France fell to the Italians. Mussolini was prepared to cooperate with the Germans in the extermination program, but a section of the Italian administration was unenthusiastic and thwarted the operations. With respect to the solution of the Jewish problem in Italy proper, the Nazis decided to call in Himmler himself to conduct the talks with the Duce. Insofar as other countries under Italian rule were concerned, the accused and his associates complained bitterly over the saboteur Italian administration in southern France, Greece and Yugoslavia. These complaints were summarized, amongst other things, in a letter drafted by Eichmann on February 25, 1943, addressed to the Foreign Ministry, and signed by the head of the Gestapo, Müller, who also referred to Eichmann as his source in the body of the letter. The letter complained of the Italian authorities' attitude and their constant habit of taking the side of the Jews. This greatly interfered with the final solution, Müller wrote, and even partially thwarted its implementation, since other countries pointed to this attitude on the part of one of the Axis powers as an excuse for their hesitation to act against the Jews. Heavy pressure was exerted on the Italian authorities through the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ribbentrop. All these approaches were prepared by Eichmann, who refused to reconcile himself to the escape of a few tens of thousands of Jews from the dragnet covering Europe. As a general rule, the Italians adopted delaying tactics and succeeded in saving thousands of Jews from certain death. When the Italians left Monaco, Eichmann asserted that 15,000 Jews were living within the territory of the Principality and demanded their incorporation in the scope of the general operation. The German consulate in Monaco stated that the number of Jews was no more than 1,000, and Eichmann persisted, claiming that he knew as a result of a personal visit that the number specified by him was the correct one. Ultimately, even he had to admit that the number of Jews in question was only between 1,000 and 1,500, and his office requested that appropriate steps be taken against them. Apparently, the operation was successfully carried through, for in July 1944, the German consul in Monaco was able to announce that there were no more than 40 to 50 Jews left in the Principality. The same energy, the same care to seal up every rescue loophole are to be seen in other areas as well. An Einsatz commander operated in Luxembourg and looked after legislation, the looting of property, the introduction of the Jewish badge, territorial concentration at Fünfbrunnen, and the deportation of Jews. Eichmann's henchmen Bosshammer and Dannecker operated in that part of Italy occupied by the Germans after the fall of Mussolini and Badoglio's surrender. On October the 16th, 1943, an extensive roundup of Jews in Rome took place, and from there the wave of arrests spread to the Italian north. Thanks to the assistance of the Italians, who hid many Jews at the risk of their own lives, the hunt proved unsuccessful. The Italian clergy also rescued Jews and hid them in monasteries. As I have previously stated, the Pope himself intervened on behalf of the arrested.
Arrestations such as the burning down of synagogues and the extortion of heavy collective fines. The Serbian and Croatian Jews were concentrated in camps, including Jasenovac, where 20,000 Jews were executed. The women and children were concentrated in Stara Gradiska and Đakovo, and many died either from disease or through direct extermination. Jews from Germany, Czechoslovakia and Austria en route to Palestine were captured in Yugoslavia on the Danube. These people, 1,107 in all, were taken by the Germans to the Sabac camp and there exterminated. The Serbian Jews were thus done to death, mostly on Serbian soil, in accordance with Eichmann's personal suggestion to which I have already referred. Eichmann recommends shooting. The surviving victims were rescued as a result of partisan operations in which the Jews took part. In Croatia, the accused operated through his representative Abromite. The Croatian Jews were deported to the extermination camps between March and July 1943, after the Jews had been isolated and anti-Jewish legislation had been passed by the Croatian government and its Minister of the Interior, Arto Kovic. In April of the following year, Department IVB4 complained that the operation in Croatia had still not been completed, and the Foreign Ministry explained in reply that this was due to the large numbers of mixed marriages in the region. In Slovenia, a part of Yugoslavia, Adolf Eichmann had an additional task: the deportation of the non-Jewish Slovenian population to Serbia in order to evacuate the area and to resolve national problems in accordance with the Führer's decision. We shall submit to you the deportation orders and the 30 reports on the operation carried out against 14,000 Slovenians who suddenly uprooted from their homes where their fathers had lived before them and deported to Serbia and Croatia. The execution of this task, too, was placed in the hands of the experienced uprooter of populations, Adolf Eichmann. The planning of this deportation involved 250,000 people. The extermination in Slovakia, which had been established as a separate political unit, was conducted in accordance with the general formula. Here also, the territorial principle on such matters as looting of property was applied. Those deported for extermination were compelled to sign affidavits of voluntary relinquishment of their property, which was valued at a total of some 7 billion crowns. Eichmann's representative in this matter was Dieter Wisliceni, and Eichmann also came personally to deal with the matter. Slovakian allies were found in Prime Minister Tuka and Mach, the Interior Minister, who were among the first leaders of the satellite countries to cooperate in deporting Jews. After 52,000 Jews had already been deported from Slovakia, an attempt was made to ransom the lives of those remaining in return for monetary. Some $20,000 were transferred to Wisliceni, according to his own account, while other sources claim that the amount involved was something between $40,000 and $50,000. Slovakian officials also received money. Pressure was exerted through church circles, and the Slovakian government began to have doubts about continuing the deportations. Ludin, a German ambassador, reported that owing to the influence of the church and the corruption of the Slovakian administration, the 35,000 Jews remaining in Slovakia had been issued with documents exempting them from deportation. In the meantime, Wisliceni succeeded in deporting another 3,000 Jews. Eichmann immediately applied counter-pressure. He commissioned Fritz Fiala, a Slovakian journalist, to write articles in the Slovakian press describing how he had visited work camps in the East and seen with his own eyes the good living conditions that the Jews enjoyed there. Strong pressure was also applied by the German Foreign Ministry, and ultimately Wisliceni and later Alois Brinner returned to Bratislava. The roundups began in September 1944, and once again more than 12,000 Jews were deported, while many more thousands were killed in Slovakia itself. Eichmann decided to try and extort additional profits from the Slovakian Jews. He demanded of the Slovakian government a payment of 300 marks transfer money for every Jew deported to the work camps. Here too, we see Eichmann's hand in everything. Important matters were handled by him personally through direct contact with Tuka, the Prime Minister, and the Interior Minister Mach. It was to him that the Foreign Ministry addressed its repeated requests to allow Slovakian representatives to visit the work camps to which the Jews were ostensibly being sent. He refused so adamantly, however, that the Foreign Ministry replied that his refusal would endanger the possibility of getting more Slovakian Jews deported. The Foreign Ministry explained that Mach, despite all his good intentions, would be unable under existing conditions to overcome the opposition of his government colleagues to additional deportations to the east. Eichmann retorted that a visit to the Polish camps by the Slovakian representatives was simply